Two cities surrendered to sin and damnation, Sodom and Gomorrah, unrolled the carpet of horror through every street, where laughter mingled with the cries of innocence and lust merged with the wildest violence. When the outcry of such iniquity reached the heavens, they faced divine wrath. A rain of fire washed and forever purified what was once profane, turning to ashes the trail of corruption that dared to flourish under the sacred gaze. In difficult times after the Great Flood, a man named Abram rose amidst idolatries. His soul pulsed with questions that no god of clay or metal could answer. When markets teemed with vanity and false gods were praised with empty rituals, Abram felt the flame of a calling impossible to ignore. Behind his steps echoed the promise of a single God, whose voice urged him to depart for a land he did not yet know, but which held a greater destiny. Without hesitation, Abram gathered his wife, servants, and flocks. He left behind his father's house and the web of human alliances. He crossed deserts of cutting wind and starry nights, guided by an invisible compass. Each grain of sand reminded him of the renewed covenant, the blessing of an inheritance not measured in acres, but in faith. His companion was Sarai, whose steadfast presence eased doubts and strengthened her husband's heart. Together they traveled challenging paths, weaving hope with each step. Upon reaching Canaan, Abram erected his first altar among solitary oaks. There, raising his staff meant recognizing a power greater than the walls of Ur or the palaces of Egypt. In Bethel, he traced a circle in the earth, deposited offerings of fresh fruit and roasted meat, and felt Jehovah's compassionate presence enveloping him like a mantle. The voices of ancestors fell silent before this renewed faith, giving way to the divine whisper that promised to multiply his roots like the stars in the firmament. However, not every desert was a refuge. Hunger drove Abram to Egypt, where he tried to save his own skin through human subterfuge. By pretending that Sarai was his sister, he almost inadvertently lost the blessing, but the Lord, zealous of his covenant, intervened. Magician priests felt the weight of an invisible gaze. The moisture in Sarai's eyes revealed her purity. Back in Canaan, he knew that God's hand had guided him through the secret chambers of pharaonic courts, teaching him that truth, though costly, was the foundation of all trust. Returning to the pastures, Abram met Melchizedek, king of Salem, distributing bread and wine in the name of the Most High God. This brief encounter recognized the patriarch as a priest and friend of Jehovah. From there, blessing blossomed into growing prosperity. Herds of sheep and oxen proliferated like swarms of locusts. Servants occupied previously abandoned hills, and his tents seemed to multiply until they touched the horizon. Still, Abram's heart sought something deeper than gold or silver. One afternoon, under the generous canopy of a carob tree, the divine voice broke through the murmur of leaves. Jehovah promised him a son, even in Sarai's old age. "Look to the sky and count the stars if you can, so shall your descendants be." The words sounded like an ancient hymn, but reverberated vigorously in the patriarch's chest. Abraham, then not fully believing, laughed inwardly, for the promise seemed impossible. Yet it became seed in fertile soil. Sarai, leaning over the crackling fire, released sighs of hope. Each dawn, she stretched her hands to the sky, imagining a child's laughter echoing through the valley. Between confidences and tears, Abraham assured her, "God does not fail." In the distance, a young man tended flocks that would grow with the blessing of both. It was Lot, a nephew who had learned from his uncle the art of hospitality and reverence for Abraham's God. His destiny was intertwined with that of this uncommon patriarch. The first rays of sun tinged Abram's tents with gold when Lot, his nephew, appeared on the horizon. A young man with a curious gaze, Lot had grown under the patriarch's teachings, learning to trust divine promises as one learns to read the wind. Together they crossed deserts and valleys, sharing hopes and challenges, until both felt the breath of prosperity rest upon their hands. Formidable flocks grazed on the plains. Herds of sheep, goats and cattle doubled under the weight of increase, fruits of favorable downpours and the diligent care of Abram's servants. Luxurious tents arose around the encampments, and tents marked by star designs, sign of the covenant with the Most High, adorned the hills. The blood brothers, united by family ties and unwavering faith, saw God add blessings to each herd. Their coexistence was harmonious, but abundant creation brought subtle disputes. Abram's shepherds and Lot's argued over the same water wells, the same tamarisk shadows. The ground, once easily divided, had become narrow before herds that grew like swarms of locusts. Although the climate was peaceful, danger germinated silently. Scarcity of resources tends to sow more than thirst and hunger. It sows strife. On a morning when the wind blew strongly, disagreement erupted. Shepherds from both camps accused each other of invading others' fences, diverting newly planted vine tendrils, and taking each other's livestock. Raised words became clenched fists. The specter of division hovered over the fraternal alliance, and for the first time, Lot and Abram sensed that abundance, when not well managed, can corrupt even the soundest of relationships. Abraham, a man of faith and peace, gathered his nephew in the shade of an ancient oak. The renowned hospitality of his camp gave way to an arid valley of hesitation. "It is not right that there be strife between us," said Abram, his gentle voice echoing among the hills. "We are relatives, and this land still supports our joint journey. If possible, let us be brothers, not enemies." His proposal came not with orders, but with a wisdom that only intimacy with God confers. Lot's choice sealed the course of both. Looking east, the nephew spotted the plain of Jordan. It was a verdant oasis, irrigated by 4 great rivers, as if the earthly paradise itself stretched before his eyes. The promise of immediate prosperity spoke louder than the security of remaining beside his uncle. Lot, with a divided heart, said, "Choose then you, that I may take what seems best." Abram's gesture of generosity was an example of humility and detachment. Abraham bent down, traced 2 parallel lines in the sand, and offered the young man first choice. Lot, without delay, walked toward the fertile valley. The tents followed him like moths chasing light. The patriarch raised his eyes to the sky and murmured a silent prayer. "May the Lord be with you, as he has been with me." The separation was not the end, but the unfolding of a greater purpose, though both did not yet see all the pieces of this divine chessboard. The sun was rising, tinting the hilltops where Abram remained with gold, but Lot, his nephew, was already descending toward the Jordan plain. The separation had been conducted in peace, with a silent embrace and a murmured blessing. "May the Lord be with you, as he has been with me." At these words, Lot, eager to sense the wind of prosperity, turned his eyes eastward, where verdant fields appeared like an oasis amid the semi-arid landscape. As he approached the plain, Lot felt his heart race. The pastures stretched endlessly, covering gentle hills and moist valleys. Rivers meandered through the countryside, nourishing tender grasses that bloomed in shades of emerald. Along the banks, leafy trees offered generous shade, and clear water streams mirrored the sky. It was a land where cattle and humans could prosper side by side, far from the recently dissipated disputes in Abram's camp. With each step, the landscape seemed to witness Lot's happiness. He imagined multiplying flocks and tents, sheltering families who smiled to the sound of harps and songs of gratitude. In his hands, he carried Abram's instructions. Always keep alive the faith in the God who had guided their ancestors. However, the fascination of the new horizon attracted him like an invisible magnet, sometimes obscuring the memory of the sacred covenant. As he approached Sodom, Lot noticed something not reflected in the superficial beauty. Along the stone streets, pieces of raw meat and discarded bones fell at the mercy of hungry dogs. Children ran amid the hubbub, but their smiles sometimes displayed an expression of fear. In open taverns, men and women toasted with scarlet wines, laughing loudly, often without reason, a laughter that bordered on contempt for others' suffering. The first news arrived in whispers. Sodom's power came from bloody alliances, and justice was bought with gold. Those who did not kneel before the royal palace were condemned to ostracism or death. Lot, divided between the promise of wealth and inner fear, turned his gaze to the river, seeking refuge in the crystalline image of the current. But the current also brought rumors. There were empires of pleasure and depraved altars of worship to vulgar gods. Gradually, Lot set up his camp near Zoar, a neighboring city, where the soil was less fertile, but proximity to Sodom attracted travelers, merchants, and business opportunities. He created his main tent there, placed secondary tents for his servants, and organized a corral along the dry bed of a seasonal torrent. Within a few weeks, cattle and domestics multiplied, and the young man came to be seen as a figure of influence. In his journey, he visited markets and audiences in palaces, exchanging stories with generals and learning the subtleties of power. However, With each offer of proximity to the court of Sodom, Lot felt growing unease. There was something in the opulence of those palaces that corroded the soul like fire corrodes dry wood. Trays of exotic fruits hid poisons. Halls where excessive drinking took place became affected by sparking fights. The promise of prosperity was accompanied by a toxic mixture of human vanities and profane sacrifices. One night, under the pale glow of the moon, Lot climbed a nearby hill to contemplate the city. In the distance, he saw rows of torches aligned on the walls, and from them rose a tenuous smoke. It was as if the earth itself exhaled a heavy odor, a mixture of impure incense and burnt flesh. In his heart, Lot felt a tremor. Sodom's aura was not just seduction, but an invitation to the abyss. Still, the poison had already penetrated his heart. Deals were closed with the aristocracy. Alliances were formed with a simple nod. Favors were obtained in exchange for invitations to nighttime parties in doorless palaces. Lot walked through rooms illuminated by perfumed oil lamps, feeling elevated. But before the mirror, he saw in his eyes the shadow of a man seduced by vanity. In his camp, servants commented on offers of additional lands and livestock joint venture agreements with local nobles. The meadow, which until recently had been a refuge for innocent lambs, became the stage for obscure transactions. Washed down with expensive wine, Abram's blessings seemed distant before the seduction of gold and power. Yet on silent nights when the cold wind descended through the Jordan Valley, Lot remembered the peace of the hills where he had grown up, Abram's wise counsel, and the promise of a God who was a shield. Each star in the sky seemed to whisper to him, "There is a high price for every earthly treasure." And at that crossroads between promise and perdition, Lot continued to approach Sodom, oblivious to the destiny of judgment awaiting those cities, and to the echoes of a covenant that had once saved his uncle from the same temptation to trust only in gold. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when the gleaming army of the four kings crossed the Jordan plain. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, sovereign of Elam, and Tidal, ruler of the Goyim, united their forces in a pact of power that transformed fertile plains into a battlefield. The rumor of easy riches and fertile oases had reached their ears. The prosperity of Lot, Abram's nephew, had become an irresistible attraction for royal greed. Without warning, the hosts advanced. Caravels of warriors held spears high. War chariots crackled over dry gravel. Hearts of men accustomed to tranquil lordships burned with ambition. The coalition of the four kings first attacked the cities of Admah and Zeboim, razed Zoar, and imprisoned local kings until reaching the walls of Sodom. In a short time, the word defeat sounded like a funeral bell among the citizens, and multitudes fled in panic through narrow alleys. Lot, accustomed to the comfort of tents and retinues of servants, was caught by surprise. While participating in an audience in Sodom, he found himself surrounded by armed soldiers. His servants surrendered, his goods plundered. In the end, Lot and all his family, along with their wealth, became spoils of war. Rope shackles tightened around his wrists and made him march, head down, under cruel gazes. At that moment, the seed of his hope died. He had trusted in the gold of the plain, and gold had made him a prisoner. When news reached Abram's ears, the patriarch felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. It was not just the capture of a relative. It was an outrage against the sacred covenant God had made with him. Under the tents, the sky seemed heavy with dark clouds. Women sobbed. Children asked why their uncle was late in appearing. Servants exchanged worried glances. Abram rose with the firmness of a rock moved by indignation. In the distance, the echo of enemy trumpets mingled with the clamor of captives. Without delay, the patriarch summoned his most faithful men, 318 trained warriors, young men forged in discipline and knowledge of the desert. Each had learned the handling of the spear and teamwork, but above all, they knew the God who walked with Abram. The leader's holy fist gathered these men around trembling lamps, silent vows, and promises of quick victory. "I will not rest," proclaimed Abram, "until I free Lot and rescue our people." Under the cloak of night, the troop departed. Miles of sand witnessed the sure step of the curious warriors, marked by the hope of justice. Each horse neighed softly, each spear glinted in the light of the waxing moon. There was no time for hesitation. The fury of Chedorlaomer and his allies needed an immediate response. Abram divided his men into squadrons, detailed the route through the mountains of Ephraim, and traced the lightning siege. At the break of dawn, the armies met at the banks of the Brook of Dan, where the enemy coalition was cooking the captured cattle. Half-asleep guards were having coffee, while prisoners were tied to improvised logs. Abram, with racing heart, ordered the silent advance. The 318, moved by faith, followed him in silent rows, catching the adversary's vigilance like accurate arrows. At the exact moment, a blaze of torches rose under a gesture from the commander. The shock was immediate. Spears sounded like thunder. Cries of surprise mingled with the clinking of swords. It was such a violent surprise attack that in a few minutes disorder took over the enemy camps. Soldiers disengaged clutches of surprise. Kings became confused on broken thrones. The night then became Abram's ally. The enemy hosts, struck in the belly of vanity, did not know how to react. As Lot saw a flash of golden light cross the sky, he heard the roar of liberation. His shackles were cut by a faithful servant, the door of his prison knocked down by tireless shoulders. Amid the chaos, Lot rose with gratitude, embraced each companion who had guided him there, and lifted his face toward the stars. Abram's promise was fulfilled once more. When the first ray of sun tinted the valley, Abram and his men were marching back, followed by defeated kings and liberated hostages. Entire recovered caravans wound their way along the path, carrying provisions, servants, and goods plundered by the four kings. The enemies, bound in compact rows, tasted the flavor of defeat they had previously only served to others. Upon reaching the camp, Lot fell to his knees before Abram. Tears sprang to his eyes, and in the patriarch's gaze was tenderness and relief. "God was with us," murmured Abram, "for he elevates the weak and humbles the proud." Among songs of gratitude, the army celebrated the sovereign victory. The episode not only saved a man, but confirmed that Jehovah's covenant with Abraham was as firm as stone walls. The walls of Sodom rise under the scorching sun like sentinels of unbridled arrogance. Within them flourishes an oppressive wealth, houses of gleaming stone, markets crowded with expensive spices, and perfumed halls where luxury mocks the needs of others. Merchants charge obscene prices for a handful of grains, and beggars line up in squares, hungry and ignored. The city's prosperity is not a sign of blessing, but of a heart hardened by greed. In Sodom's high court, justice is a fragile commodity. Judges in embroidered tunics sign sentences in exchange for shining coins, condemning widows to banishment and absolving sons of nobles who beat defenseless servants. The balance that should weigh equity swings amusingly at the taste of gold, and the words law and right become empty echoes, repeated only to deceive those who still dare to hope for mercy. The powerful plot conspiracies in the silence of luxurious halls, weaving betrayals and dividing the spoils of conquests. Elite soldiers patrol the streets, not to protect the weak, but to collect extra taxes from merchants and silence, with steel and fire, any whisper of revolt. Legal disorder is reflected in social chaos. Families break apart, children are sold, and the cry of the oppressed drowns in the chorus of insolent laughter. Lust in Sodom reaches levels of savagery. Men and women surrender to bacchanals in public squares, moving torches and frenzied dances under the moon. Grace is corrupted into a storm of sin. Passers-by are seduced into secret chambers, where honor is exchanged for a few gulps of putrid wine. Those who refuse face a servant's steel or the merciless mockery of aristocrats downstream. Violence flows down the corners like blood spilled on dry ground. Heinous crimes are committed shamelessly. Assailants drag brides into alcoves, ruffians pursue foreigners through dark alleys, and gangs compose symphonies of screams when they make torture a game. The stench of burnt flesh and perfidy permeates the air, transforming simple breathing into sacrilege. Even in worship altars, devotion turns into farce. Priests of pagan gods fill themselves with gold while offering toxic incense to stone statues. Children are offered in sacrifice, their tears a tribute to the arrogance of those who believe death can buy divine protection. But in the silence of the heavens, no fury rises in favor of such impious cults. Meanwhile, amid so much horror, voices of lament arise. Widows who lost husbands in legal disputes weep over remnants of dry bread. Mothers search for children taken by gangs, whose whereabouts were lost in the veil of night. Prisoners of war, locked in the dungeons of Sodom, plead for a day of justice. These cries join a chorus of anguish, a clamor that the earth can no longer contain. This clamor rises like dense smoke, reaching the celestial palace. With each sincere prayer, divine anger rehearses a distant echo, and God himself raises his eyes from the throne of justice. He remembers the covenant he made with Abraham, a covenant that is not limited to blessing, but that demands righteousness from faithful hearts. The hearing of such pleas brings forth the zeal of a father, offended by the perversion of his creatures. Amid the delight of oppressors, the universe falls silent, preparing for the voice that will break the veil. Jehovah's compassion is as intense as his judgment is implacable. When the cry of the innocent echoes with intensity, it is impossible to ignore the cry of their wounds. Each tear shed by a just person becomes a cry that does not dissipate in the winds, but remains imprinted in the eternal book. 3 messengers with luminous countenances descended from heaven, sent by Jehovah to investigate the clamor rising from Sodom, and at the same time reaffirm the covenant with Abraham, bringing the promise of an heir. The dual mission, judging the perversion in the plain and renewing the divine pact, required discretion and compassion. Therefore, disguised as common travelers, the 3 approached Abram's tents in the heat of the day, ready to test the patriarch's heart. At the door of his tent, Abraham rested in the shade of a date palm, contemplating the horizon. Upon spotting 3 solemn figures approaching, he rose immediately, his heart inflamed by the sense of welcome he had learned from his ancestors. He ran to meet them, prostrated himself in reverence, and with a cordial voice exclaimed, "My lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass by me, but stay here a while." Without waiting for a response, Abraham ordered his servant, "Run to the tent, bring fresh water for them to wash their feet, and let them rest under this tree." Then he turned to the visitors. "I will fetch a piece of bread, and you shall satisfy your tired body. Afterward, you may continue your journey with lightness." Abram's diligence mixed urgency and humility, like one offering the best of his own home. Sarah, hearing her husband's orders, took 3 measures of fine flour and, setting to knead, formed tender loaves. She took the largest calf from the pen, gave it to the servants to prepare with fresh butter and newly milked milk. The aroma of baking bread and browning meat rose like a prayer to heaven, a spontaneous offering from one who recognizes the sacred in the act of feeding the pilgrim. Meanwhile, Abraham remained standing in the shade before the 3 men. He served them milk and butter on a wooden footstool, offered them the first slices of hot bread, and let them rest. Between sips of milk, he murmured kind words about the journey. "Tell me where you are headed, and I can guide you through the shortcuts of this land." But a mystery lingered in the visitors' gaze as they listened in silence. When they were satisfied, they raised their faces and with a calm voice asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham smiled and replied, "Behold, she is in the tent." One of the 3 then revealed a distinct brightness in his face and spoke with authority, "I will return to you at the appointed time, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." The words penetrated the air like seed cast on fertile soil, awakening astonishment and hope. Sarah, who was behind the tent entrance, heard the announcement and laughed inwardly, saying to herself, "Already advanced in age, can I still savor maternal joy?" The contained laughter echoed in the tense chamber between the divine and the human. The messenger, however, leaned slightly and observed, "Why did you laugh, Sarah? Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" The question hovered in the semi-darkness of the room. With the promise established, the 3 messengers rose. Abraham, humble, stood before them for farewell, accompanying them to the shade of the date palm. He offered them the hospitality that flowed from his faith, shelter, food, and friendly words, as one who recognizes that, in serving the traveler, he serves God himself. He bid them farewell with a final blessing. "May the road be light for you, and may truth accompany you." As they resumed their journey toward Sodom, the messengers bore in their countenance the determination of those who need to confront evil and, at the same time, the tenderness of those who announce life. The footprints left in Abraham's soil were marks of a sacred encounter, where the divine stooped to man's table to reveal mercy and judgment, hope and power. And thus, the patriarch's hospitality became a prelude to events that would forever change the destiny of nations. The evening light was tinting the hills around the great terebinth in Mamre with gold, when Abraham retired beneath its protective canopy. Still vibrating in his heart were the words the 3 heavenly visitors had brought him, the announcement of a son, and the judgment that would fall upon Sodom. As he watched the sun set, He turned toward the tent and entered into prayer. Then Jehovah's voice sounded soft as a breeze, but firm as distant thunder. "Abraham," called the Lord. And he, leaping to readiness, prostrated himself with his face to the ground. "Here I am," he whispered. The divine voice rose among the branches. "I have seen the outcry that rises from Sodom and Gomorrah, the outcry of their sins and of the blood shed by the oppressed. I must erase from the map the evil that sprouts there like a poisonous herb. However, I ask, shall I hide this from my friend Abraham?" Abraham raised his body, knelt, and looked at the darkening sky. His heart oscillated between fear and hope. "O Lord, you are just in all you're doing. If there are 50 righteous people in Sodom, will you spare the entire city for the sake of those 50? The tone of his voice mixed boldness and reverence. Boldness in questioning the one who can do all things, reverence to the one who is the source of mercy. A divine silence hovered for moments, and then Jehovah answered, "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will abandon my judgment and not destroy the place because of them." Abraham's heart filled with gratitude, but his intercession, like a rushing river, did not cease. "Supposing 5 of those 50 are lacking," he ventured tenderly, "and if only 40 justifiable ones exist?" The Lord, patient in his compassion, said, "For the sake of 40, I will spare." Abraham bowed even more, as if divine support were felt in the night breeze. "And if you find 30? He continued. "And 20? He asked next, fearing there wouldn't be enough 10s to contain the fire of judgment. Jehovah, in sweet response, granted. "For the sake of 30, I will not cause calamity. For the sake of 20, I will be restrained in my arm of justice." The patriarch trembled, his hands interlaced in his lap. He knew that, in such numbers, dwelt the tenuous hope of salvation for many. With a firm voice but already marked by emotion, he continued, "I dare ask one more thing. What if 10 righteous people are not found?" When he asked for the last time, Abraham was already breathing slowly, like one preparing for the silence that would follow God's answer. "If I find 10 righteous people, will you spare the entire city for the sake of those 10? He questioned. The response came with a tone of sublime tenderness. "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy Sodom." The echo of these words reverberated against every rock, every branch, every fiber of Abraham's body. Even after hearing "for the sake of 10, Abraham could not raise his gaze. Such was the intensity of his gratitude and reverence. He remained kneeling, his body almost fused to the ground, his soul surrendered to the model of justice and mercy he had received. Then he slowly raised his face, his eyes moist, and replied, "Now here I am. Speak then, Lord. May your servant remain small before you, but greatly grateful for your patience." Jehovah, whose voice was like a stream of peace, granted silence. That moment became sacred, the most intimate point of the covenant between the Most High and an old man, yet full of faith. These were not mere numbers moving. It was about the lives of thousands of innocents and the revelation of a God who hears the righteous but judges the wicked. As the dialogue ended, Abraham rose with difficulty, weighing the privilege of having interceded. Each step toward the tent sounded like one walking on coals of responsibility. He now glimpsed the weight of carrying a nation in the veins of his own faith. For if 10 pious men could stop divine fury, how many could rise in intercession for the afflicted of our time? Inside the tent, Sarah heard the murmur of voices and came out to meet Abraham. He, speechless from the blessing he had just received, embraced her and shared the miracle of having seen God incline to his request. Together, they contemplated the starry sky, each constellation reminding them of the promise, a numerous posterity and a justice that would extend to those who persevered in righteousness. Meanwhile, in the heavens, Jehovah mobilized his messengers to descend to Sodom. The mercy granted to those who would flee would be as real as the judgment reserved for those who persisted in pride. The dialogue of intercession had ended, but the drama of that plain was just beginning, and yet it carried within it the hope that the minimum of human justice could reflect the maximum divine compassion. Twilight enveloped the walls of Sodom when 2 heavenly messengers, still concealed in human form, approached the city gate. The evening breeze carried the acrid odor of corrals and boards creaking under the comings and goings of guards. The angels, wearing simple tunics, walked distractedly, observing it from the height of eyes that could see the untouched heart of that place. At each bend in the streets, They saw white stone houses and piles of garbage, clogged cisterns, and artisans closing their doors before sunset. On the threshold of the gate, Lot, who exercised the function of an improvised magistrate there, spotted them with curiosity. His experience of judgment and mercy, forged with Abram, made him recognize the sacred reflected in the visitor's gaze. He ran to meet them, offering them hospitality for the umpteenth time that night. "My lords," he greeted them, his voice muffled by the echo of the walls, "please don't proceed further. Enter my house, wash your feet, and receive shelter. Allow me to prepare a simple supper. Afterward you may go wherever you wish." The angels, without hesitation, accepted the invitation. Lot guided them through a narrow courtyard, between stables and dirty tents, to the interior of his house, whose walls exhaled the strong smell of oil smoke and burnt bread. Servants came with pitchers of water and clean cloths, while Sarah, distressed, bustled in the kitchen to prepare bread and meat. Outside, the ticking of ash trees dominated the silence before the moral storm that was announcing itself. No sooner had the doors closed than the pressure of the people of Sodom erupted against the gate. The crowd, moved by a depraved collective power, gathered shouting, "Bring out those men who entered your house." Harshly, they pushed the gates, men with contorted expressions and cruel laughter, women around instigating them, throwing insults. The flickering light of torches crossed the cracks, projecting twisted shadows in Lot's house, as if stone demons were taking shape in dark corners. Lot, hearing the clamor, felt his pulse accelerate. He opened the main door and raised his voice with authority. "My brothers, I beg you not to commit such evil. These men are my guests. Do not commit any shameful act against them." The crowd, however, responded with insults and threats. "Bring them out here so we may know what to do," they vociferated. "Having brought strangers to rape our honor, it is right that we have the last word." The gathering grew in fury and volume. With a heavy heart, Lot stepped back and, in a desperate gesture, offered the angry voices his own daughters. "I have 2 virgins. Allow me to present them. Do with them as you please." The silence that followed was as dense as the moonless night. The torches flickered for a moment, then a mocking laugh exploded among the stones of the courtyard. "Go away, old fool," they shouted. "What do we care about your daughters? We want those men here." Then, in a swift and supernatural movement, the angels pushed Lot back inside the house and closed the door with a bang. With firm hands, they blocked the attackers. Immediately, a dense mist flooded the courtyard, enveloping each face in indistinct figures. The invaders tried to advance but stumbled over each other, lost in a labyrinth of their own evil. Groans of pain and confusion accompanied the erratic steps as they sought the exit that night concealed. Lot, on his knees, trembled with fear. Inside the house, the atmosphere seemed to vibrate with divine power. The angels standing before him raised their heads in unison, and their voice, when it came, sounded like the distant echo of trumpets. "Enough. The soul of this city is corrupted. The cry of the righteous has been heard, but perversion has overflowed. Go, run and keep the door closed. I will only come out to warn you about what will come." Their features, once serene, now carried the fire of imminent judgment. Amid the chaos that was dissipating, Lot sat on a cold stone, covered with sweat and dismay. His mind whirled with the scenes he had witnessed, the depravity of the people, the offering of his daughters, the merciless siege. He wondered how he had allowed these creatures entry, while finding himself unable to protect them from themselves. The servants, whispering in dark corners, gathered the flock and prepared to depart, fearing the fury that stirred outside the walls. Outside, the crowd, deprived of vision, wandered without direction, stumbling on jailers and ox carts, staggering in cries of frustration. Some, desperate, even beat against stone walls, hacking with their swords without finding a target. The aura of the celestial presence, placed in defense of Lot's house, had imposed silence on the impetus of the perverse, as if an invisible wall separated them from mercy and judgment together. Lot, feeling the passage of time, remembered the words of the visitors, the final proof that Sodom would be judged. He rose, weakened, and went to the door, glimpsed the blind anguish of the people, and wept. He knew he could save no one beyond his family. The realization dawned. That place no longer held the remnant of goodness that had sustained his hope. He turned to the angels, his voice choked. "What shall I do now? My strength is not enough." The messengers, with austere gaze, approached. One touched his shoulder, Another extended a luminous scroll, on which was written that he should gather Sarah, his daughters and sons-in-law, and depart before the hills shattered in fire and brimstone. The instructions were clear, direct, testifying that there was no more time for hesitation. Lot's heart raced, and he realized that siege had not been merely physical, but a call to the definitive separation from sin. The first light of dawn had barely broken the horizon when Lot was startled awake by the voice of the heavenly messengers. Still dazed, he felt firm hands touch his shoulder. They were the angels who, in a gentle yet authoritative command, ordered him, "Arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here. Flee without delay. Do not look back, nor stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, lest you perish in the destruction of Sodom." The urgency in their words made Lot's heart race. The sleeping valley held memories and children of the city, but the fear of disobeying the Most High was even greater. Lot raised his face to the trembling sky and almost implored, "If you permit me, Lord, I ask only for refuge in Zoar, the small city south of here. I do not feel capable of enduring the inhospitable mountain. There, at least, I will find shelter for my family." The angels exchanged a brief look of compassion and answered, "We grant this request as well, for Zoar is too small to bring the final judgments upon you. Go, but hurry, for time is running out." Comforted by the permission, Lot felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew that every second was precious. Without losing a moment, Lot ran back to the tent to awaken Sarah and his daughters. The moonlight still bathed the warm sands when he gently touched Sarah's shoulder, whose calm breath contrasted with the fear he felt. "Arise," he whispered. "God commands our flight. Pack what you can, unleavened bread, jugs of water, and some cloaks." The daughters, still sleepy, wrapped themselves in veils and helped gather the little they possessed. Outside, astonished servants awakened at their master's call, not understanding but obeying. While the women tended to the provisions, Lot gathered the few animals grazing around. Still sleepy sheep, goats silenced by the cold. He instructed the servants, "Advance with the beasts and the flock to Zoar. Lead them without dispersing." Some hesitated, but the grave tone of the patriarch admitted no refusal. Each object brought was chosen for its sustenance value: a jar of oil, pieces of salted meat, some dried fruits, and essentials for the road. Little remained of the old life, now reduced to the indispensable. Lot opened the tent door and felt the cold dawn wind. The plain, taken by silence, seemed to slumber under a mantle of stars. Hasty steps followed along the beaten earth path, flanked by grey rocks and myrrh bushes. At each turn, Lot gazed south, seeking the outline of the hills where Zoar nestled. The moon, now hidden by heavy clouds, illuminated the sand, revealing footprints of ancient travelers, as if the route had been used by others forced to depart. The journey, though short in distance, felt long to Lot's nerves. The ground trembled slightly, reminding him of the angel's words. "Flee, for judgment approaches." The daughters pressed their hands on their mother's shoulders, and Sarah, standing erect, murmured low prayers. The servants exchanged apprehensive glances as they guided the flock over gentle slopes. Each one's breathing mingled with the rumor of the animals. The distant crackling of some rock breaking under the weight of the world presaged the urgency of the step. When he sighted the first houses of Zoar, Lot felt a weight lift from his chest. The city, formed by low adobe walls and painted wooden doors, lay at the edge of a small oasis, where palm trees curved over stone cisterns. Gradually, the group approached the gate, and Lot raised his voice. "Open the gates, for judgment will come upon me if I delay." The guards, still half asleep, recognized in the visitor's exhausted countenance a plea for divine help, and removed the bolt. The first oil lights lit up on the posts, and curious neighbors peered through the gaps. Lot, leaning on the stone pillar, extended his hands to his family. "Enter quickly, for there is no time to lose." Sarah and the daughters crossed the threshold, relieved to step on firm ground. The servants moved the flock inside the low wall, while Lot exhaled, feeling his legs weaken. There, in Zoar, he had found the first shelter after nights of worry. Inside the house Lot had rented, provisions were made. Skins were spread on the floor. A small offering of bread and water was prepared for strangers who might seek shelter. Lot, still breathless, gathered his family in a circle and spoke words of comfort. "The Lord has been merciful to us by allowing this refuge. Here we will begin anew, keeping the order we have received." A reverent silence took over the environment. Only the low voices of the daughters were heard exchanging promises to rebuild their lives. In the following hours, Zoar awakened to accommodate Lot and his people. While servants prepared a straw bed, the patriarch recalled the commandment, "Do not look back." The uncertainty of what he had left behind mingled with gratitude for the shelter granted. He looked through the narrow window, contemplating the oasis before him, and knew that this would be the place where, through obedience and divine intercession, his family would find safety, at least until the new course that the Most High would trace. When the first timid light of dawn began to tint the sky with a pale blush, a presage made itself present in the air. The stars still flickered, as if hesitating to leave, witnessing the moment when heavenly judgment would break the barbarity that had taken root in the plain. Lot, crouched on a rocky elevation, felt his entire body shudder, not from earth or wind, but from the divine announcement that still echoed in his mind. As the tones of pink and lilac blended in the east, a thick silence spread through the valley, burying the murmur of winds and the morning song of birds. Suddenly, a distant but deep rumble tore the veil of silence. It was like the roar of a titan awakening from sleep, or the thunder of armies on the march, yet there were no human trumpets, only the resounding voice of a superior wrath. The rocks under Lot's feet vibrated, shaking small clouds of dust into the air. Down below, where the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah still ran terrified, the adobe houses and stone towers began to tremble, announcing that heaven was putting into action the pronounced sentence. The first fragments of flame appeared among dense and heavy clouds, like torches lit in the firmament. A rain of fire and brimstone descended in waves, rolling down the slopes and sweeping the city streets with an inextinguishable heat. The glare intensified, illuminating walls and ramparts with an orange brightness, while sparks danced in the air, molding themselves into reports and stampings that rang in the memory of those who still had breath to feel fear. The acrid odor, a mixture of sulfur and burnt flesh, invaded the nostrils of Lot and his daughters, making each breath a martyrdom. The constructions, once alive with voices and shameless laughter, disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Towers collapsed in whirlwinds of dust, transforming into smoking craters. Palaces and temples, symbols of opulence and idolatry, fell like clay toys, swallowed by flames that licked each stone. The paved streets, full of holes and garbage, burned in rivers of fire, consuming carriages, animals, and men without distinction. No human cry surpassed the voracious crackling of judgment. Within the chaos, the hurried silhouettes of inhabitants tried to escape the fury coming from above. Pairs of bare feet left tracks of wet ashes on hot stones. Some, consumed by despair, raised their hands to the sky, imploring mercy, but not even a breath of wind abated the rigor of punishment. Others, tangled in tattered mantles, stumbled over each other, wishing only to gain the edge of the fire. Each fallen body became incandescent, reduced to live embers before going out in a gasp of smoke. Lot kept his eyes fixed in the distance, fighting against the urge to look back. The memorial of the past lay there, transformed into a spectacle of destruction. His chest ached with each flash that reflected in his daughter's tears, whose eyes mirrored the anguish of seeing the barriers that had sheltered violence and sin for so long crumble. These were ambiguous memories, horror and relief, for mercy needed justice, and justice did not spare the perverse. As the sun fully rose, the spectacle amplified in intensity. The entire valley converted into a furnace of rotating flames, within which human vestiges were swallowed. Lightning cut through the smoke, generating snapshots of bluish clarity before fire reconquered the protagonism in the scene. Celestial thunders echoed, announcing that the divine throne was testing the old order of the world. It was as if the earth itself rejected the place, expelling it from its bosom. When the dust settled, the valley revealed itself unrecognizable. All around, mounds of vitrified stone and ash extended as far as the eye could see, resembling a lunar landscape. Incinerated trees, transformed into pieces of coal, dotted the banks of a river dried by fire. No vestige of human life remained, only Lot's family, mute witness to the end. He knelt on burnt soil, hands dirty with soot, and felt that there ended a cycle of rebellion and divine compassion, on the tenuous line between disobedience and redemption. Among the silhouettes of stone and ash, One detail settled as a unique landmark of the scene, a figure that maintained human pose, sculpted in salt, gleaming under the sun. It was Lot's wife, who, in a last gesture of longing, had seen the condemned city and disobeyed the order not to look back. Her transformation into a pillar of salt became a symbol of a late love, and fatal for what was already irrevocably lost. The salt, eternal in its rigidity, coated each fold of the mantle the woman wore, crystallizing it as a petrified memory of a faith that turned against the divine order itself. Each crease of her clothing, each curve of her body, remained as it was at the hour of disobedience, but now immutable. The rising sun bathed the pillar with warm rays, and the salt refracted the light in small prisms like tears that would never dissolve. Lot, upon realizing that his wife had sealed her fate there, was taken by a mixture of compassion and excruciating pain. He approached, touched the cold salt with the tips of his fingers, feeling the bony hail that disintegrated under his touch. There, the female figure, in silence, reminded everyone that late curiosity can imprison the soul. There was no human crying, no echo of lamentation, only the murmur of ashes carried by the wind, surrounding that natural monument. The daughters, their eyes already accustomed to the horror of dawn, also approached in mute reverence. They dared not touch the pillar but deposited dried flowers at its feet, as one offers consolation to a ghost of salt. The scene, so paradoxical, united the translucent beauty of crystal with the tragedy of a love that looked where it should not. It was the punishment and warning contained in a mineral block, reminding that obedience is life and disobedience, death. When Lot finally walked away, his last words to the pillar of salt echoed only in the emptiness of that incandescent landscape. May your memory be a perpetual testimony to the limit between human desire and divine sovereignty. And so he remained, beside the monument, until the shadow of clouds covered the sun, and the entire valley plunged into dusk again, as if trying to hide the spectacle of judgment and mercy that had closed there forever. Abraham remained in his tent, dancing between wakefulness and sleep, when the dawn sky began to tinge with a misty gray. It was not the common sunrise. There was something in the air that put his soul on alert. He rose, adjusted his mantle, and went out to the stone courtyard, feeling on his lips the still cold taste of the night. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of the well and the whisper of olive trees in the wind. Then, in the distance, he noticed a vertical shape rising over the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah, a dense column of smoke, black as coal, ascending toward the sky. Abraham's heart tightened in dismay and compassion. Lot, his nephew, lived in that region. He now remembered having interceded with Jehovah to spare up to 10 righteous people. His breath faltered, but instead of paralyzing himself in fear, he gathered strength and ordered young Eliezer, his faithful servant, to prepare the camel. I will take water and bread, for I must walk as far as the eye can see, to contemplate with my own eyes the destiny of the plain. The servant bowed and left quickly, while Abraham remained meditating on the magnitude of divine judgment. With each step on the gentle slope that led to the mountaintop, Abraham saw clouds of smoke insinuate themselves on the horizon, as if God were pouring cloths of mourning over the earth. The acrid odor arrived in tenuous breaths, mixed with the smell of sulfur that made the back of the throat burn. Even so, Abraham continued. The walk was brief, but to him it seemed very long, a test of faith and courage. When he reached the rocky projection, he sat down, leaned on his staff and looked toward the valley's cleft. Down below, under the veil of soot, the plain seemed extinct. The rising sun reflected in the smoke, creating columns of light that sprouted like flaming spears. The air trembled with the heat of judgment, and the contours of the cities disappeared and reappeared amid the flashes of embers that still burned here and there. Abraham felt God's justice manifest in all its implacability, but at the same instant understood that smoke was also a testimony to his fulfilled word, as inexorable as tender in the preservation of the innocent. He gathered his knees to his chest and wept silently. Abraham's tears were mixed, lament for those who had been lost in corruption and gratitude that Lot and his family had been saved. In his heart echoed the Lord's promises, I will make of you a great nation, and through your generations they shall be called blessed, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you. Genesis 12:2-3. The smoke, symbol of consummated judgment, was not the end of the story. It was the threshold of a covenant that would never be broken. As the wind raised particles of ash, Abraham lifted his gaze to the sky and murmured a prayer of thanksgiving. "Sovereign Lord, you who see all and pursue justice, have evaluated the outcry and acted in righteousness. I thank you for guarding my relative and delivering the righteous from among the wicked. May the power of this day be engraved in my memory, and may I never doubt your faithfulness." Each word sprang from his heart with profound reverence, for he felt that he walked between judgment and grace. Recalling the tablets of the promise of descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven, Abraham found consolation. Even when a generation is lost in sin, God does not withdraw his purpose. The flame of the covenant burns eternal. In the smoke rising from the plain, he saw the contrast between the transforming power of justice and the mercy that chooses a remnant. The covenant with him, Abraham, became a firm foundation for the hope of a restored world. After a time, the Lord of the camels appeared, bringing fresh water and bread warmed by the remaining embers. Abraham welcomed him with a slight nod of his head and shared the food in meditative silence. It was not necessary to speak much. The scene before him spoke for itself. The fury of God putting an end to an epoch of intolerance and violence. However, the presence of smoke reminded him also of other fields, of the day he would see the cloud of glory rest upon a tabernacle, and later, of a man hanging on a hill, carrying the weight of judgment and divine love. When the sun had fully bathed the mountain with heat, Abraham rose and extended his mantle to shake off the ash that had settled on it. He ordered the servant to accompany him back to the camp, but first stopped once more for a last look at the plain. In that dark cloud, he saw not only the mortal remains of cities, but also the seeds of a promise, that of a pilgrim people who would live according to righteousness, recognizing in God the Judge and the Redeemer. Back at the tents in Mamre, Sarah received him with a sad smile. He told her what he had seen and heard, and together they contemplated the eternal covenant God had made with him. Abraham repositioned himself under the terebinth, now as a living witness that divine justice does not delay, but also that mercy never fails. In his mind, the smoke of the plain became a symbol of two inseparable realities: the radical cut with evil and the infallible faithfulness of the Creator. That afternoon, Abraham walked to the altar he had erected years before when God had spoken to him about the promised land. There he placed a new offering of lamb on the embers, and the aroma rose as a sweet fragrance to the heavens. It was a gesture of consecration. "Not only have you delivered justice, Lord, but you have made me heir to your covenant. May the smoke of this offering be a perpetual memorial that I trust in you, and that I will wait until I see all your promises fulfilled." After the hasty flight to Zoar and the destruction of the cities, Lot and his two daughters felt growing in their hearts the fear that divine judgment would extend even further. The permission to remain in Zoar was provisional. Obedience dictated that they should seek refuge in the mountains far from any influence of the condemned valley. On a clear morning, with few provisions and the leanest sheep of the flock, they left the small city and climbed through a narrow, dusty and silent gorge. The journey was arduous. The path wound between limestone cliffs where the wind lashed the face and diluted any trace of civilization. Lot, once lord of a prosperous plain, now walked slowly, protecting his daughters from stumbles and treacherous cliffs. At each turn, they saw only rocky valleys and the vast sky, without trees or watercourse. The absence of nearby springs made isolation even more severe. Occasionally, Lot pierced rocks with a small tool, but found only splashes of murky water. As night fell, they camped in natural caves where the daughters accumulated dry wood for the fire, and Lot deepened in prayer, seeking comfort before the petrified silence of the mountains. The stars shone without light pollution, but the brightness was not enough to warm the afflicted hearts. Sarah and Ben-Hadad, the daughters, followed their father closely, every night embraced in darkness, whispering psalms that recalled the hymns of their ancient faith. Isolation also brought the weight of memory. The remembrance of Lot's wife transformed into a pillar of salt, the smoke of judgment, the cry of the men of Sodom. As the days dragged on, food diminished. Hard breads, some dried fruits, and the handful of remaining water were rationed with discipline. The flock, once numerous, was restricted to a few lean goats, whose skins kept the daughters warm in the cold dawn. Without other men nearby, Lot and his daughters lived in a solitary routine, marked by the fear that death by thirst or cave collapse could come at any moment. Despite the fear, there was a deep bond between them. Lot cared for his daughters with paternal tenderness, and they, in return, strove to keep the flame of hope alive. They sang ancient songs, recited the promises of the Most High, and kept the clay utensils clean. Each cloth stretched to the wind became a symbol of resistance. However, the instinct for survival and the conviction that they were the only remnants of a divine disaster began to undermine their spirits, announcing the tension that would culminate in subsequent events. With the passing of several months in absolute seclusion, Lot and his daughters realized that no man would approach to offer them consolation or generation of descendants. The conviction that the human lineage had been almost extinguished covered them with an existential fear. Would the name of their father and that of their family be lost forever? Semi-disoriented by the thirst to perpetuate paternal blood, the daughters began to conspire in a whispered dialogue, preferring the shadows of the cave as confidant. The eldest daughter, fearing that darkness would completely end the history of her people, took the painful decision to intoxicate her father with wine. Using a stored wineskin, she mixed water and fermented grapes, a liquid that Lot, accustomed to a purer wine from fertile vines, barely recognized. One night, as Lot fell asleep with a clouded mind, she crawled to his bed, inspired by a purpose she considered noble, though forbidden. In the embrace of drunkenness, Lot did not perceive the gesture. The woman with whom he copulated, under the veil of darkness, was his own daughter. When dawn dissipated the cave's mist, the eldest daughter reached the threshold of the hideout, discovering the late lucidity of her father. Lot, upon waking, felt in his core that something had broken. His dignity, the most intimate taboos, the sacred order that governed kinship. However, remorse found no voice. Both he and his daughter remained silent, aware that there was no possible return. Months later, a boy was born who received the name Moab, father of the multitude, for from him would come the Moabites. News ran among the rocks. There is a descendant of our lineage. The younger daughter, seeing that the maternal instinct had at least fulfilled the urgency to prolong the legacy, devised an identical stratagem. She repeated her sister's scheme. She made Lot drunk and in the shadow of the cliffs obtained from her father the conception of another son, whom she called Ben-Ammi, son of my people, originator of the Ammonites. The double gestation and later the birth of Moab and Ben-Ammi represented paradoxically the continuity of Abraham's heritage through a moral stain. Lot, tormented by the weight of guilt, took refuge again in prayers, begging forgiveness and asking that God not curse future nations. The daughters, although confronted with the enormity of the transgression, believed that the scarcity of survivors justified the only route left to them to perpetuate faith and family. When the last cloud of smoke dispersed over the plain and the columns of salt became silent statues at sunrise, there remained the deep echo of a story engraved at the core of human existence. Among ashes and rocks, a man, his daughters, and an eternal covenant could see the tenuous thread that unites justice to mercy, despair to hope, the fall to redemption. Lot, looking back, discovered that attachment to the past can crystallize the soul in repentance. His daughters, driven by the urgency to secure a future, trod dark paths, reminding that even in the most extreme decisions, God can gather life from the depths of error. Abraham, erected on the rock of faith, contemplated the flames and trusted in the covenant that embraces generations, showing us that divine love extends beyond the limits of disobedience. In each memory, that flame that consumed Sodom and Gomorrah, the contained cry of Lot, the silent prayer of Abraham, echoes an invitation to live under the protective shadow of the Most High, trusting that His justice corrects and His grace restores. May our gaze not be fixed on ruins, but rise to the stars of promise, where God, faithful in each generation, calls us to walk with renewed confidence, hand extended toward the future that only He can reveal.